So you're a healthcare provider, and your practice is growing. That's fantastic, right? But with that growth comes this maze of compliance challenges. And one of the biggest hurdles? Figuring out your DEA registrations. In this explainer, we're going to break down exactly how to manage your DEA compliance when your practice expands to multiple locations. Here's how we're going to tackle this. We'll start with the big question about having multiple addresses. Then we'll dive into the DEA's general rule and a really crucial exception you have got to know about. After that, we'll get into the tricky stuff like dealing with state lines and using home addresses, and we'll wrap it all up with a practical compliance checklist you can actually use. All right, let's jump right in with a scenario that pretty much every growing practice faces. You're opening a second, maybe even a third office, and bam, suddenly you realize you're dealing with a whole new layer of federal regulations. And that really is the million-dollar question, isn't it? If you've got multiple locations, do you need a separate DEA registration for every single one? The short answer is usually yes. But, the devil is in the details, and those details are what can get you into some serious trouble if you're not careful. So let's break down exactly what the rules are. Okay, so to really get this right, we have to start at the foundation. We have to look at the foundational rule from the DEA itself. This is the baseline that pretty much governs everything else we're going to talk about. So here it is, straight from the Code of Federal Regulations. The rule says a separate registration is required for each principal place of business. But what does that actually mean for your practice? The key words to zero in on here are how controlled substances are handled, specifically if they are dispensed. Let's translate that into plain English. Here's the simple takeaway. This is the thing to remember. If you physically have controlled substances on site, meaning you store them, administer them, or dispense them, that location needs its own DEA registration. Full stop. No gray area there. To make this even clearer, just think about these real-world scenarios. You have a clinic with a locked cabinet of controlled meds. That needs a registration. What about an office where you give injections from a supply you keep on hand? Yep, that needs a registration too. A facility that kind of acts like its own little pharmacy and dispenses drugs right to patients? You guessed it, it absolutely needs its own DEA registration. But what if you're not storing, administering, or dispensing anything? This brings us to the single biggest exception in the DEA's rules, and it's one that a lot of multi-site practices rely on every single day. This right here, this is the critical dividing line. On one side, you have any activity that involves the physical presence of controlled substances. Storing, administering, dispensing, any of those, and you need a separate registration for that location. But on the other side, there's a huge exception. If you are only writing prescriptions at your secondary offices, you might be okay to operate them all under a single registration. Now hold on, using this exception isn't a free-for-all. There are some very strict conditions. First, all of your practice locations have to be within the same state. Second, and this one is absolutely non-negotiable, there can be zero controlled substances stored, administered, or dispensed at those secondary prescription-only sites. And finally, you always have to remember that states can have their own, often stricter rules, so you must check your local state laws too. All right, let's talk about two other areas where we see providers get tripped up all the time: practicing across state lines and the temptation to use a home address for registration. These are critical pitfalls you want to avoid. Let's be crystal clear about this one. This is an ironclad rule. Your DEA registration is fundamentally tied to your state medical license. So if you practice in California and you open a new office over in Nevada, you absolutely must get a Nevada state license and then apply for a brand new DEA registration for that state. They don't transfer. There is no portability. So what about your home address? I mean, with the rise of telehealth, it sounds like a convenient option, right? Well, while the DEA technically allows it, there is a massive catch. Registering your home means it becomes a controlled premises in the eyes of federal law. And the consequences of that are huge. It means DEA agents can show up at your house for an unannounced inspection. It means you are legally required to maintain DEA-level security and record-keeping right there where you live. Any little slip-up could lead to serious enforcement action. Honestly, it's a risk that is almost never worth taking. Okay, so we've covered the rules, the big exception, and the major pitfalls. Now, let's get practical and put it all together into a simple checklist to keep you compliant and on the right side of the law. Here is your 4-point check. First, always confirm your state licenses are active before you even think about applying for a DEA registration there. Second, you have to keep obsessive, meticulous records at every single registered location. Third, if you move an office, even just down the street, you have to formally notify the DEA of that address change. And fourth, make sure your staff is trained on the specific protocols for each site. Compliance really is a team effort. So we'll leave you with this final thought. As your practice continues to grow, as it evolves, take a hard, honest look at your current setup. Is your DEA registration strategy truly compliant, or is there a hidden risk just waiting to be discovered? Thanks for joining us for this explainer.